April 1945. Berlin is a city on the edge of annihilation. The thunder of Soviet artillery echoes through the shattered streets, and the air smells of dust, smoke, and fear. Behind makeshift barricades, piles of bricks, overturned carts, splintered doors, stand the last defenders of Hitler's Reich. They are not hardened veterans. They are old men, stooped and gray, their hands trembling not only from age, but from the cold steel of the rifles they clutch. Beside them, boys barely 16 grip Panzerfausts, anti-tank weapons almost as tall as they are. Some wear ill-fitting uniforms, others fight in civilian coats, their armbands the only sign of a soldier. This is the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. Hastily formed in the final months of the war, they were the last desperate answer to the Red Army's unstoppable advance. They have little training, scarce ammunition, and almost no chance of survival. Yet, they stand. Not for victory, that dream is long gone, but for the city, for their homes, and perhaps for a leader who has led them into ruin. In these final days, the streets of Berlin will run red, and the Volkssturm will write their brief, tragic chapter in history. By the end of 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had torn through German lines, reclaiming every inch of Soviet soil lost since 1941. Cities and towns that once flew the swastika now bristled with red flags. The Wehrmacht, shattered and exhausted, could do little but fall back. In the West, the Allies had broken out from Normandy, liberated Paris, and swept through Belgium and the Netherlands. British and American forces stood at the banks of the Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier, preparing to strike into the heart of the Reich. Even in Italy, Allied troops clawed their way north, step by bloody step. Hitler could see it. The war was slipping away. But surrender? Never. In his eyes, to submit to inferior races was unthinkable. Instead, the Führer vowed to fight to the last breath, even if it meant sacrificing the nation itself. The German people faced a grim reality. The enemy was closing in from both sides, the skies belonged to Allied bombers, and every day brought the front lines closer to their homes. The Reich was running out of time, and Hitler was running out of options. Total war. That was Hitler's command. If the Reich was to survive, every man, woman, and child would have to serve. Factories would work without rest, cities would feed the war machine, and the people themselves would become its last weapon. On October 18, 1944, Heinrich Himmler announced the creation of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. Under orders from Hitler and Party Chancellery Chief Martin Bormann, the Nazi Party would conscript all males aged 16 to 60. Age, injury, or inexperience no longer mattered. If you could stand, you could fight. Even the Hitler Youth, 500,000 boys, were called to arms. Many had never fired a real weapon before. Now they were expected to face Soviet tanks and American infantry. Hitler believed these men would defend their homes with fanatical resolve, buying time for a miracle that would turn the tide of war. But the reality was far harsher. They would be poorly trained, poorly armed, and thrown into battles they could not win. The Volkssturm was not just a military unit, it was the embodiment of a dying regime's desperation. And in the months ahead, these men and boys would be sent to meet the full fury of the enemy. Training for the Volkssturm was a cruel illusion. Most recruits drilled only on weeknights or Saturdays, 2 weeks at best before they were sent to the front. Their training focused on marching, saluting, and party discipline, not on real combat skills. Many never even fired a live round before stepping into battle. Weapons were a patchwork of whatever could be scavenged: old rifles from World War I, captured enemy guns, and a handful of Panzerfausts. Ammunition was scarce, and the Wehrmacht kept the best weapons for its own frontline troops. Helmets and uniforms were mismatched, some pulled straight from warehouses untouched for decades. Despite being a Nazi party creation, the Volkssturm often fell under Wehrmacht command. The army had the experience and logistics the party lacked, But even with military guidance, the militia's chances were slim. On the Eastern Front, they would face Soviet armor and artillery. In the West, Allied tanks and air power. Their barricades were made of rubble. Their supply lines barely existed. Every man in the Volkssturm knew the truth. This was not a fight for victory. It was a fight for survival, and for many, it would be their first and last battle. The Volkssturm entered battle with almost no hope. On paper, Hitler had envisioned millions of armed citizens. In reality, far fewer answered the call, and those who did faced overwhelming odds. On both fronts, the militia suffered catastrophic losses. Entire units were wiped out in days. Some formations on the Eastern Front endured casualty rates of 70 to 80%. The survivors often fled when Soviet or Allied forces pressed their attack. For many, loyalty to the Führer crumbled under the terror of artillery barrages and tank assaults. In Berlin, these ragged defenders held corners, streets, and ruined buildings for hours, sometimes minutes, before being overrun. Boys who had never seen combat were cut down alongside veterans of the First World War. The lucky ones were captured. The rest lay in the rubble. Some Volkssturm fighters fought with genuine courage, driven by patriotism or desperation. But others simply wanted to go home, to protect their families from the chaos closing in. By spring 1945, the militia had proven what the world already suspected. No amount of propaganda could turn civilians into an army capable of stopping the Red Army or the Allies. The sacrifice was real, but it was also in vain. With the Volkssturm collapsing, the Nazi leadership turned to an even darker idea: war in the shadows. The plan was called Operation Werewolf. It was to be a guerrilla resistance, a secret army of fanatics who would strike from the ruins of the Reich. Under the SS's control, small bands of men and women would hide among civilians, assassinate enemy officers, sabotage supply lines, and execute any German who cooperated with the occupiers. Joseph Goebbels poured fuel on the idea, flooding the airwaves with propaganda. He spoke of ancient legends, of wolves stalking the forests, waiting to tear out the throats of invaders. Posters promised revenge. Radio broadcasts called on citizens to fight on, even if Berlin fell. The Allies took the threat seriously, preparing for an underground war after victory. But the reality was far less terrifying than the myth. There was no central command, no mass uprising. Werewolf attacks amounted to scattered potshots and a handful of assassinations. Most Germans were too exhausted, too broken to fight on in secret. Operation Werewolf became a ghost story, a weapon of fear that never truly materialized. And with each passing day, the Reich's shadow grew shorter. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its once dominant fighter wings were grounded by fuel shortages, destroyed airfields, and a deadly lack of experienced pilots. But Hermann Göring's Air Force still had one card left to play: desperation. On New Year's Day 1945, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise assault on Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. At dawn, hundreds of German fighters swept low over the countryside, hoping to catch the enemy sleeping after New Year's celebrations. The attack was daring, even brilliant in concept. Allied bombers were destroyed on the ground and radar barely registered the incoming planes. But the price was staggering. Dozens of Luftwaffe aircraft fell not just to Allied guns, but to German anti-aircraft batteries that mistook them for the enemy. The operation left the Luftwaffe bleeding, with no reserves to replace the losses. From then on, they turned to extreme measures: suicide missions, aerial ramming, and experimental weapons that bordered on fantasy. It was no longer about winning the skies. It was about making the Allies pay for every step into Germany, no matter how high the cost in German lives. With its strength shattered, the Luftwaffe descended into the realm of the suicidal. If they could not outfight the enemy, they would destroy them through sheer sacrifice. In April 1945, a special ramming unit, Sonderkommando Elbe, took to the skies. Their mission was simple and terrifying: aim their fighters directly into the fuselages of American B-17 and B-24 bombers, tear them apart in midair, and then, if possible, bail out. Most never had the chance. Out of 120 aircraft launched, 53 were lost. 13 bombers fell from the sky, but the Luftwaffe's losses were irreplaceable. At the same time, the Leonidas Squadron revived its kamikaze-style missions. Volunteers piloted explosive-laden aircraft on one-way trips to destroy Soviet bridges over the Oder River. The attacks were brutal and desperate, often destroying little but claiming the lives of the pilots. Fuel was scarce, aircraft were few, and training was rushed. By now, the Luftwaffe was fighting with scraps, dreams of miracle weapons replaced by the grim reality of men flinging themselves into death. These were not strategies of victory. They were the final convulsions of an air force and a regime on the brink of extinction. While the Luftwaffe burned itself out in the skies, the Kriegsmarine was collapsing beneath the waves. Germany's once proud navy had been shattered, its surface fleet either sunk or trapped. But Grand Admiral Karl Donitz refused to surrender the seas. The answer lay in new technology, the Type 21 U-boat, a sleek, advanced submarine, capable of staying submerged far longer than its predecessors. In theory, it could stalk Allied convoys undetected and strangle their supply lines. But in practice, it was too late. Few were built, fewer still made it to sea, and none could change the course of the war. So the Navy turned to the Kampfschwimmer, combat divers, explosive-laden speedboats, and miniature submarines. These elite units attempted daring raids in the English Channel, the North Sea, and the Baltic. They slipped beneath bridges to plant explosives, steered tiny craft into enemy harbors, and launched night attacks against Allied ships. The bravery of these men was undeniable, but so were the odds against them. Mechanical failures, rough seas, and relentless Allied patrols doomed most missions before they even began. By 1945, the Kriegsmarine's fight was no longer about control of the oceans. It was about defiance, and dying hard. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling on every front. Its last-ditch forces, the Volkssturm, the werewolves, the suicide pilots, and the naval commandos, had fought with a mix of courage, fanaticism, and sheer desperation. But none of it mattered. The Allies and the Red Army were closing in, unstoppable. In Berlin, Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. The skies were ruled by Allied bombers. The seas belonged to the enemy. Every miracle weapon promised by Nazi propaganda had failed to appear in numbers that could change anything. For the men and boys who fought in these final months, the reality was brutal. Many died in seconds. Others were captured, their war ending not with glory, but in a prison camp. Families were torn apart, cities reduced to rubble, and an entire nation lay in ruins. Hitler's dream of victory had become a nightmare for his own people. The Volkssturm and other last-ditch units had been sacrifices to an illusion, a belief that the Reich could be saved when it was already beyond saving. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over, and with it, the final, tragic chapter of Nazi Germany came to an end. In the quiet after the storm, the echoes of battle still haunted the air. Cities lay scarred, and the memories of those who had fought, on every side, lingered like shadows at dusk. Yet, from the ruins, a fragile hope began to stir. Flags were lowered, weapons silenced, and for the first time in years, the world exhaled. Victory was not without cost. The price was etched into the faces of survivors and the empty chairs at countless tables. But the story was not just of war. It was of endurance, sacrifice, and the unyielding human will to rebuild.